Diego Santos tightened the cloth around his hands with the same deliberate rhythm he had learned as a child, a rhythm older than any ring he would ever step into, older than the mats beneath his feet, older than the very idea of organized competition. As he repeated the motions that his grandfather had ingrained into him back in Cebu, he felt a small spark of calm cutting through the tension twisting in his stomach. The Iron Cage gym in Las Vegas hummed with noise, weights clanking, pads thudding, fighters shouting inside various training stations, but Diego's mind was somewhere else. He was remembering the sandy yard where he first learned how to pivot his hips for a strike, the bamboo trees whispering in the background, and the proud voice of his grandfather explaining that Arnis was more than a martial art. It was a system designed for survival, a living thread of Filipino history woven through generations of warriors. Diego had worked construction for years to afford even part-time training, sacrificing sleep, free time, and the comfort of financial stability just to chase the dream that had been burning inside him since he was a small boy. Today was supposed to be a chance, not a fight, not a tryout, but a sparring session with a fighter who barely needed introduction. Marcus the Hammer Davidson, a powerhouse of the sport, a man who carried 20-plus wins, devastating knockouts, and an aura of invincibility. Marcus was the kind of fighter whose presence could silence a room, and when he stepped into the gym with his entourage, that aura filled the space instantly. Taller, heavier, sculpted with the kind of athleticism that seemed engineered for destruction, Marcus moved like a man who never had to doubt his abilities. His confidence seeped into every expression, every step, every casual glance cast around the room. Diego immediately felt the weight of comparison pressing against him. Where Marcus looked like he belonged among giants, Diego looked like he had wandered into someone else's world. Even the way Marcus examined him, eyes dropping down to his rattan sticks peeking from his bag and then to Diego's lighter frame, made the air feel heavier. Though no words were spoken, Diego understood the meaning behind the smirk. His heritage, his tradition, his training, everything that shaped him, was being dismissed before he even moved a muscle. It wasn't the first time someone underestimated Arnis, but coming from a fighter on Marcus's level, surrounded by onlookers ready to laugh, the sting cut deeper than usual. Diego pushed back the embarrassment tightening in his throat and forced himself to focus. He had come for an opportunity, however small. Even if Marcus thought little of him, even if the gym's fighters thought he didn't belong, Diego intended to show the best version of himself. But once they stepped into the cage, that resolve was tested immediately. Marcus attacked with an intensity that left Diego scrambling to stay upright. Every blow felt like a small explosion. Jab, cross, leg kick, the kind of combinations that came from years of elite competition. Diego tried to use his angles, stepping sideways, circling out, redirecting incoming strikes through footwork that had been drilled into him since childhood. But the sheer physicality of Marcus overwhelmed his attempts at strategy. A sharp punch split his nose, warm blood dripping into his mouth. A brutal leg kick compromised his stance. When he was pressed against the cage, Marcus unloaded hooks and body shots that rattled Diego to the core, each one echoing inside his ribs like a hammer strike. Vision blurring, breath thinning, Diego felt himself slipping into survival mode rather than execution of any technique. And then, with almost no warning, a hook he couldn't track detonated against his jaw, sending him crashing to the mat. The gym erupted with laughter, applause, shouting, none of it in his favor.
When Diego finally staggered out of the gym, bruised and foggy, he sat in his car for nearly an hour, unable to start the engine. The rattan sticks rested on the seat beside him like a question he didn't know how to answer. His phone buzzed with a message from his grandfather asking how the sparring went, but Diego couldn't respond. Shame pressed down on him like a suffocating weight. Instead of letting humiliation break him, Diego felt something inside shift. If Marcus believed Arnis was irrelevant, if the entire gym saw the art as nothing more than a relic or a dance, then Diego would prove the opposite. He booked a flight home to the Philippines, not because he wanted escape, but because he needed to reconnect with the very foundation of who he was. When he returned to Cebu and stepped onto the familiar ground of his grandfather's training yard, he asked to learn the real, complete, battlefield-rooted Arnis. His grandfather, recognizing the determination in Diego's voice and posture, agreed without hesitation. Training in Cebu reshaped Diego in ways he didn't anticipate. Each day felt like a rediscovery, not just of Arnis, but of himself. The environment alone grounded him. The warm sunlight filtering between palm leaves, the dusty ground beneath his feet, the scent of earth and ocean blending together in the humid air, the rhythmic creaking of bamboo structures nearby. Far away from the noise of bright gyms and commercial fight culture, Diego immersed himself in a world where technique mattered more than reputation, where precision carried more weight than muscle mass. His grandfather taught with patience and stern expectation, guiding Diego through drills that pushed his endurance, sharpened his senses, and refined his understanding of movement. He studied the subtleties of footwork that allowed him to appear in places opponents didn't anticipate, trained his eyes to read micro-movements in shoulders and hips, and developed his ability to intercept attacks before they fully formed. These weren't just skills, they were instincts forged through repetition. His grandfather often reminded him that Arnis was built around real combat, not sport. Weapons weren't props, they were extensions of intention. Every movement, whether offensive or defensive, aimed to conclude conflict quickly. That philosophy guided Diego's transformation. With each passing day, he grew more efficient, more precise, more attuned to the timing that defined Arnis at its core. He also poured hours into studying footage of fighters who incorporated Filipino martial arts into their systems, some subtly, some openly. He analyzed how famous martial artists had drawn from Arnis' principles, even those who practiced other fighting styles. The more he observed, the clearer it became that Arnis wasn't outdated. It wasn't inferior, that it had simply been misunderstood. After nearly 2 months of relentless training, Diego returned to Las Vegas with a different kind of confidence, not loud or arrogant, but quiet and stable, like a pillar rooted deep in the earth. Soon after arriving, his coach called with unexpected news. Marcus's opponent for an upcoming event had pulled out due to injury, and the organization needed a replacement immediately. They needed someone conditioned, someone willing to step in without preparation, someone who could save the card. Diego was far from a famous name, far from a promising contender in the public's eyes, but he was available, determined, and eager for redemption. Many fans ridiculed the matchup, calling Diego a warm-up opponent, a sacrificial offering, an easy win for Marcus. But Diego refused to let external noise infiltrate his focus. While the world mocked him, he continued training with deliberate intensity, replicating the movements that had become second nature. On fight night, the arena pulsed with electricity. Thousands of spectators gathered under the bright lights, the roar of the crowd vibrating through the floor. He stepped into the octagon with no expectation of approval, only the intention to show the truth of the art he represented. When Marcus entered the arena to thunderous applause, Diego didn't shrink. He observed the way Marcus moved, the way he prepared his shoulders before committing to power shots. Diego watched everything, internalizing the information just as his grandfather trained him to do. When the fight began, Marcus stormed forward with the same aggressive explosiveness he used in sparring, clearly anticipating another quick and easy display of dominance. He read Marcus the way he had been taught to read opponents during his training. The shift of weight onto the lead leg, the coiling of muscles, the telegraph hidden in the rotation of the torso. At the moment Marcus launched his first heavy punch, Diego cut diagonally inward at a precise 45-degree angle, sliding past the power line of the strike and entering the space Marcus had left vulnerable. That single movement changed everything. Diego countered immediately, his strike following the same mechanics used in weapon thrusts, compact, direct, and efficient. The blow landed cleanly. Marcus staggered. The crowd gasped. Diego didn't stop. Using the flow of Arnis, he chained strikes together without pause, each motion setting up the next one, each step altering the angle to keep Marcus guessing. He struck the arm that Marcus attempted to lift for a clinch, targeting a vulnerable point that forced Marcus to recoil. Diego entered with surgical precision, launching a strike patterned after a stick thrust, but delivered with his fist. The impact was decisive. Marcus fell backward, hitting the canvas. The moment Marcus hit the ground, the arena erupted in chaos. Fans who had been cheering for him moments earlier now shouted in disbelief. Commentators scrambled to make sense of what they had witnessed, their voices rising with excitement and confusion. The referee began a count, but even before reaching the final number, it became clear that Marcus wasn't getting up in time. The upset was undeniable. Diego Santos, the fighter many dismissed as unqualified, had just defeated the second-ranked contender with astonishing speed using techniques rarely acknowledged in mainstream MMA. The magnitude of the moment washed over Diego slowly, like a distant wave rolling toward shore. He felt the vibration of the crowd rumbling through his body, saw the flashes of cameras, heard the officials shouting commands he barely registered. He wasn't thinking about fame or vindication or even the knockout itself. His thoughts drifted to the stillness of his grandfather's yard, the sensation of ash wood striking against rattan during practice, the rough sand under his feet during morning drills, the repeated corrections, the patience, the legacy. As the officials lifted his hand in victory, expressions of shock remained frozen on the faces around him. Even Marcus, once he regained enough awareness to stand, stared at Diego with an expression far different from the arrogant smirk he had worn during their first encounter. What Diego had demonstrated wasn't luck. It was mastery. Mastery rooted in an art that Marcus had dismissed as obsolete. The reaction beyond the cage was even more dramatic. Within minutes, social media platforms exploded with clips of the knockout, slowed down, analyzed, replayed from multiple angles. Commentators debated how such a technique slipped past Marcus's defense, how Diego, someone without a major reputation, managed to execute such advanced timing. Martial artists around the world recognized the mechanics hidden in the movements, the angled entry, the interception-based timing, the destruction of incoming limbs, the weapon-rooted delivery of strikes. Forums lit up, instructors began posting breakdowns. The world, almost overnight, woke up to an art it had once disregarded. Gyms that previously offered Arnis as a secondary program, or not at all, now advertised it boldly. Seminar requests poured in. For many Filipino practitioners, the sudden surge of recognition felt overdue. Diego's victory forced the world to reconsider the value of systems built outside familiar structures. But while the global community buzzed with newfound respect, Diego remained grounded. He knew the knockout didn't erase the years of struggle. It didn't magically validate everything he had endured. What mattered most to him wasn't fame, but honoring the generations who safeguarded the art through adversity. He allowed himself to breathe deeply, the adrenaline gradually leaving his system. His phone buzzed relentlessly, messages from friends, trainers, journalists, strangers, but the one he cared about the most was from his grandfather. Knowing that his grandfather had witnessed the victory filled Diego with a profound sense of pride and gratitude. When he later called home, his grandfather's voice carried both emotion and pride. The old man had dedicated his life to preserving Arnis, handing it down with respect and care, and now the world had watched one of its practitioners use those principles at the highest level of combat. As days passed, interviews poured in. Everyone wanted to know how Diego trained, how Arnis shaped his approach, how he executed the knockout so effortlessly. Diego explained that the key wasn't strength or speed, but timing, understanding the opponent's intention before the attack fully formed, and using angles to nullify power. Meanwhile, Marcus posted a public statement acknowledging his misjudgment. His humility surprised many fans, and it marked a turning point in how fighters approached the art. Training camps began incorporating pieces of it into their curriculums, not as a gimmick, but as a legitimate tool. The knockout had sparked conversations much larger than Diego himself. Years after the fight, Diego often reflected on how a moment of humiliation in a Las Vegas gym transformed into a moment that reshaped his identity and the perception of his art worldwide. What began as a painful experience, a lopsided sparring session filled with doubt, embarrassment, and dismissal, became the catalyst for an evolution that changed the trajectory of his life. The journey taught him that setbacks were not dead ends, but redirections. He traveled frequently, teaching seminars, sharing the principles he had learned from his grandfather, and demonstrating that the art's beauty lay not just in its movements, but in its adaptability. Fighters approached him seeking guidance, especially those who had been overlooked or underestimated. He always offered the same core lesson: mastery comes from understanding, not imitation. He encouraged them to search deeper into their own cultural roots, whatever those roots might be, and to recognize that heritage is not a burden but a source of strength when embraced with intention. Many fighters found renewed purpose in this perspective, discovering parts of themselves they had overlooked. Despite rising fame, Diego remained deeply connected to his grandfather. He visited Cebu whenever he could, continuing to refine techniques, deepen his understanding, and maintain the humility that had carried him through hardship. Sometimes, young students would gather around to watch him train. They listened to his stories about resilience, cultural pride, and the importance of learning with integrity rather than seeking shortcuts. Over time, Arnis regained a level of global recognition that had been dormant for decades. Documentaries were created, schools and clubs expanded. International tournaments began featuring Arnis-based events. And through it all, Diego remained a symbol of transformation, not because he had risen from obscurity to success, but because he had honored a tradition that shaped him and carried it into a modern arena where few expected it to thrive. He understood that the legacy he had revived wasn't solely his to carry. Toward the later part of his career, when young fighters asked him for advice on how to navigate doubt, disrespect, or underestimation, he always repeated the truth forged during his journey. The most powerful response is not anger, argument, or confrontation. It is excellence. It was about proving something true, that discipline anchored in heritage becomes a force no one can dismiss. Diego's life eventually became a testament to what happens when someone refuses to abandon their roots, even when others mock them. He taught the world that authenticity, when paired with mastery, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. And long after crowds stopped chanting his name, after arenas dimmed and fights faded into memory, one story continued to circulate. A story about a fighter who stepped into the cage armed not with brute force or flashy hype, but with the quiet wisdom of his ancestors, transforming centuries of tradition into a moment the world would never forget.